For centuries, the African soil has carried both blessing and burden. Beneath its surface lies the memory of kingdoms once proud and self-sufficient, of golden empires that fed their people with dignity. But then came the ships, the chains, and the endless hand of colonial rule. Our lands were stripped, our farmers reduced to laborers on their own soil, our crops measured not by nourishment, but by profit for distant masters. Generations lived under policies that kept the African farmer poor, while foreign powers grew rich. And yet, even through slavery, famine, and exploitation, our people never lost faith in the soil. They knew that the land remembers. They knew that one day Africa would rise again from the dust, and the harvest would no longer feed empires abroad, but feed our children first. That day has come. Today, from the Sahel to the Congo, farmers are no longer beggars at the global table. They are the authors of a new chapter, where a single clove of garlic has humbled a superpower and reminded the world, Africa may be wounded, but it has never been defeated. Stay with us, because this story is more than agriculture. It is history turning, it is dignity restored. Subscribe and stand with us as Africa writes its own destiny. The story begins not with sudden thunder, but with quiet seeds planted in forgotten soil. For decades, America's Central Valley stood as the beating heart of garlic production. Vast mechanized farms, stretching across California's dry plains, supplied nearly 70% of garlic consumed in the United States and held a dominant share of global trade. Protected by subsidies, empowered by technology, and fueled by cheap migrant labor, Washington boasted that no one could challenge its agricultural might. To many, garlic seemed a small commodity, but in truth it was a billion-dollar industry woven deep into America's rural economy. Across the ocean, Africa lived another reality. In Burkina Faso, also called Burkina Faso by some, small farmers worked sun-baked land with little irrigation, often producing just enough to survive. Imports from China, Spain, and yes, from America itself poured into African markets. Local garlic struggled to compete. It was seen as inferior, too expensive, too inconsistent. Generations of African farmers carried the weight of policies that forced them to rely on foreign seeds and foreign goods, always at the mercy of global prices. Many thought Africa would never be more than a consumer, never a competitor. But history has a way of surprising those who underestimate Africa. Around 4 years ago, a quiet revolution began. In the villages of Ghana, in the fertile soils of Ethiopia, and in the dry belt of Burkina Faso, farmers began experimenting with high-yield garlic varieties resistant to pests and capable of thriving in semi-arid conditions. Governments, long criticized for ignoring agriculture, shifted course. They invested in irrigation canals, subsidized fertilizer, and encouraged cooperative farming. Most importantly, African farmers began to work together. They pooled knowledge, shared resources, and built networks that stretched across borders. By the third year, the results were astonishing. Production had soared. Fields once yielding meager crops now produced harvests bountiful enough to not only meet local demand, but create surpluses for export. And unlike in the past, these surpluses did not rot in warehouses. A new infrastructure had been built. Farm-to-market roads, cold storage units powered by solar energy, and port facilities capable of handling mass exports. For the first time in modern history, African garlic was not just surviving, it was competing. Then came the tipping point. Cargo ships began leaving African ports at record speed, their holds packed with garlic fresher and cleaner than anything leaving California. Buyers in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia flocked to sign contracts. Within a single year, African garlic exports skyrocketed by more than 500%. Revenues passed $60 billion. The once mighty American producers, burdened with high labor costs, drought-stricken water supplies, and mountains of debt, could not keep up. 2 months ago, the unthinkable happened. America's largest garlic supplier filed for bankruptcy. A company that had once crushed foreign competitors with ruthless efficiency was now itself crushed by the collective rise of African farmers. Thousands of American farm workers lost their jobs overnight. County economies that had relied for generations on garlic trade collapsed. The United States, a nation that had long called itself the breadbasket of the world, was forced to watch as Africa stepped into its role. But here lies the deeper truth. This was not just about economics. It was about symbolism. For centuries, the story of agriculture had been written in Washington, London, and Paris. Africa was cast as the dependent, the consumer, the passive actor. Now, with nothing more than patience, cooperation, and the strength of its soil, Africa had flipped the script. A humble bulb had toppled a giant, sending tremors across the corridors of power. Yet this was only the first act. Because what followed was not just an economic collapse for America, it was a global shockwave that no one could ignore. The breaking point arrived like a thunderclap. One morning, shoppers across the United States walked into their neighborhood supermarkets and found something they had never seen before: empty shelves where garlic once sat in abundance. In California, New York, and Texas, bewildered families stood staring at price tags that had doubled or even tripled in a matter of weeks. For a nation that prided itself on feeding the world, this was humiliation. The news spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed of a garlic crisis. Talk shows invited desperate American farmers to share their stories. Men and women, their hands still stained from years of labor in the Central Valley, sat before cameras with tears in their eyes, confessing that they could no longer pay their mortgages or send their children to school. Generations of farming families who had trusted in Washington's protection were suddenly cast adrift. In the halls of Congress, panic turned into fury. Senators from agricultural states thundered about unfair competition. Lobbyists for America's agribusiness giants flooded Washington, demanding emergency bailouts. Billions of dollars were pledged in subsidies almost overnight. Yet even as politicians shouted, the market spoke louder. Importers, wholesalers, and supermarkets from Paris to Dubai had already moved on. They had discovered African garlic, fresher, cleaner, cheaper, and more reliable. Why return to overpriced American supplies when a new source had proven itself not only capable but superior? On social media, images went viral. Videos showed ports in Tanzania buzzing with activity, ships loaded with garlic bound for India and Europe. Meanwhile, clips from California revealed idle tractors, fields left unharvested, and abandoned storage facilities. The contrast was too stark to ignore. Africa was rising, while America was reeling. The emotional climax came when the bankruptcy of the United States' largest garlic producer was announced. This was no small company. It was the crown jewel of America's garlic empire, the very business that had once undercut foreign farmers and dominated markets. Its collapse sent shockwaves not just through farming communities but through Wall Street itself. Stock values of related industries, fertilizer companies, trucking firms, equipment manufacturers, plunged overnight. The message was unmistakable. When Africa rose, America fell. And the reaction did not stop within America's borders. In Europe, newspapers hailed the African garlic revolution as a turning point in global trade. In Asia, leaders in Beijing and New Delhi congratulated African partners, pointing to long-term contracts that would secure their own food supplies. In the Middle East, African garlic was celebrated in markets and restaurants, praised for its freshness and competitive price. But for ordinary Americans, the sense of betrayal cut deep. For years they had been told that America was unshakable, that its farms would always be the envy of the world. Now they were told to tighten their belts, accept bailouts, and wait for a government rescue that seemed far too late. This was the climax, the moment when emotions boiled over. African farmers who had once struggled to feed their families now stood proudly as exporters to the world. Meanwhile, American farmers, once symbols of prosperity, now cried out for survival. The world was witnessing not just an economic shift, but an emotional reversal. Pride for Africa, humiliation for America. But as fields across Africa thrived and Congress erupted in anger, the question grew louder. What would be the deeper consequences, political, social, and global, of this garlic revolution? The garlic revolution did not end at the farm gate or on the trading floor. Its consequences ran deeper, reshaping lives, politics, and even the collective spirit of two continents. In the United States, the collapse of the garlic industry tore through rural communities like a slow-moving storm. Counties in California's Central Valley, once thriving on the profits of garlic exports, suddenly faced bankruptcy. Local banks reported waves of foreclosures. Schools lost funding as tax revenues plummeted. Small businesses, from tractor dealers to fertilizer suppliers, saw their customer base vanish overnight. Families who had farmed the same soil for generations found themselves queuing at food banks. The imagery was striking. America, long the world's agricultural powerhouse, now struggling to feed its own. The psychological blow was equally devastating. American farmers who had once looked down on African producers as competitors of little consequence were now forced to confront a new reality. They were no longer the suppliers of the world, but casualties of it. The narrative of American exceptionalism had cracked, leaving behind anger, despair, and confusion. Across the Atlantic, however, a different story was unfolding. In Burkina Faso, in Ghana, in Ethiopia, families were experiencing an economic uplift they had never seen before. The garlic boom created hundreds of thousands of jobs, not only in farming but in transport, processing, and export logistics. Rural poverty rates began to decline. Young men and women, once desperate to leave villages for city slums, returned to the land. For the first time in decades, farming felt like a path to dignity rather than a life sentence of hardship. Politically, this transformation carried immense weight. African leaders seized upon the garlic boom as proof that the continent could finally break the chains of dependency. They began to speak of agro-sovereignty, a vision where Africa would not only feed itself, but dictate terms on the global stage. The old model of exporting raw goods for pennies while importing finished products at inflated prices was being dismantled. In its place emerged a framework of value-added agriculture where crops like garlic were processed into oil, powder, and extracts before leaving the continent. This shift inspired hope but also raised tensions. Western powers, unused to seeing Africa in a position of strength, whispered accusations of unfair trade. Yet their voices rang hollow. After all, Africa was merely playing by the rules America had once preached: free markets, open competition, survival of the fittest. Only now it was the African farmer who proved the fittest. At the cultural level, something profound was happening. Across African cities, markets celebrated locally grown produce with new pride. Restaurants in Lagos, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa proudly advertised African garlic on their menus. What was once dismissed as inferior was now a badge of honor. Farmers who had lived in silence, overlooked and undervalued, suddenly became symbols of national strength. Even in the harsh belt of the Sahel, communities dared to dream. If garlic could be grown, harvested, and exported from once barren lands, what else was possible? The phrase Sahel desert farming began to circulate in policy discussions and village gatherings alike. It symbolized not just agriculture but resilience, the ability to coax life out of hardship, to turn dust into bread. But alongside hope, there were warnings. Economists cautioned that sudden wealth could be fragile. What would happen if Western powers retaliated with sanctions? What if dependency on a single crop left Africa vulnerable once again? Leaders urged caution, calling for diversification into maize, rice, and soy. Still, for the farmers who now held contracts with buyers from India to Saudi Arabia, the future had never looked brighter. And in the pews of churches, in the courtyards of mosques, in the gathering places of elders, one refrain was often heard. This is the moment our ancestors prayed for. It was not just about garlic. It was about reclaiming destiny. Yet as African pride blossomed and American despair deepened, the world itself was being forced to respond. How would Washington, Beijing, Brussels, and Moscow react to this new agricultural map? In Washington, the garlic crisis became more than a farm issue. It became a matter of national pride and political survival. Senators stood before television cameras, their voices trembling with anger, accusing African nations of dumping garlic on the market. Lobbyists begged for tariffs and subsidies, yet every proposal came with a dilemma. How could the United States, champion of free markets, suddenly demand protection from competition? And worse, how could it justify punishing Africa for succeeding at the very game America had long dictated? Inside the White House, emergency meetings were called. Intelligence briefings warned that Africa's garlic strategy was not isolated, but part of a wider continental movement towards food sovereignty. Wheat, maize, soybeans, all were vulnerable. A quiet panic spread through the corridors of power. If Africa could topple garlic, what else could it take? Meanwhile, the international stage lit up. In Brussels, European leaders signed long-term import agreements with African suppliers, choosing price stability and freshness over loyalty to American producers. In Beijing, officials hailed their investment in African irrigation and seed technology as a triumph of partnership. China had not loaned Africa into debt, it had equipped Africa to compete. In New Delhi, India celebrated its contracts with African exporters as a way to secure its rising food demand. Even in the Middle East, supermarket chains proudly stocked African garlic, branding it as cleaner, safer, and more sustainable. For many outside the West, the message was clear. Africa had proven it was no longer a passive participant, but a powerful player in global trade. And within Africa itself, leaders pointed to this victory as a symbol of political renewal. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré, whose name often echoed in conversations about self-reliance, was cited as a new model of leadership. His stance on economic sovereignty inspired a phrase that spread far beyond Burkina Faso: Ibrahim Traoré agriculture. It represented not just farming policy, but a broader philosophy that Africa's dignity must begin with control of its soil. The world's reaction revealed a deep truth. Africa had shifted from dependency to influence, from silence to leadership. What had once been dismissed as impossible was now undeniable. But as Africa seized new ground on the world stage, a question loomed. Would this momentum endure, or was the garlic revolution only the first battle in a much larger war for the continent's future? The garlic boom was not the destination, it was the beginning of a long journey. Across Africa, leaders, farmers, and ordinary citizens asked themselves the same question: what comes next? Would this triumph remain a single victory, or would it grow into a continental transformation capable of reshaping the global economy? One path lies in expansion. If Africa can claim garlic, why not rice, maize, cocoa, or cotton? Nations are already drawing up ambitious plans. Kenya is building garlic oil processing plants. Nigeria is scaling up agro-industrial parks. Ethiopia is investing in AI-driven irrigation systems to support new crops. The vision is clear, not only to export raw goods, but to dominate the entire value chain, from seed to supermarket shelf. Another path, however, is fraught with risk. History has shown that sudden wealth can attract sabotage. Western powers may attempt sanctions, tariffs, or propaganda to slow Africa's rise. International financial institutions, long used to dictating terms, may seek new levers of control. If the garlic revolution taught Africa anything, it is that sovereignty must be defended with vigilance. Yet the opportunities outweigh the dangers. For the first time, young Africans see farming not as a burden but as a calling. Technology, drones, solar-powered cold storage, digital marketplaces has made agriculture both profitable and appealing. Diaspora communities, inspired by the garlic story, are beginning to send investment back home, no longer as charity, but as partnership. At the cultural level, this moment carries profound meaning. For elders who remember the long nights of hunger and the days when Africa was mocked as the begging continent, this new reality feels like vindication. For younger generations, it is a call to action, to protect what has been won and to build upon it with courage. Politically, the choice is stark. Africa can either fragment, with each nation competing against its neighbor, or unite under a shared vision of agro-sovereignty. Unity will determine whether the garlic boom becomes a passing storm or a permanent season of renewal. And there is one truth every farmer knows: a harvest is only as good as the planting that follows. Garlic has opened the door. Now Africa must decide whether to walk through it boldly or hesitate and let the old order return. Which brings us to the most pressing question of all. Will this revolution fade into memory, or will it mark the dawn of an Africa that the world must finally respect? When history is written, this garlic revolution will not be remembered as the rise of a single crop, but as the awakening of a continent. From the sun-scorched plains of Burkina Faso to the bustling ports of Mombasa, Africa has proven that the soil, long dismissed as barren or backward, holds the power to rewrite global trade. The message is unmistakable. Africa no longer asks for permission, it commands respect. For generations, colonial systems stripped the land, forcing African farmers into poverty while foreign powers grew rich. Decades of dependency taught our people to doubt their own strength. Yet here we stand, witnessing farmers who once struggled to survive now supplying markets from Paris to Shanghai. The world is tasting African produce, and with every bite, it is forced to acknowledge a new reality. Africa is no longer the world's beggar, it is its provider. This moment is not about garlic alone. It is about sovereignty. It is about dignity. It is about telling our children that the prayers of their ancestors are being answered in real time. From Sahel desert farming to coastal agribusiness hubs, Africa is proving that with unity and vision, even the harshest soil can bloom into abundance. And as leaders like Traoré remind us through the vision of Ibrahim Traoré agriculture, true independence begins with control of our own land. But the story is still being written. The garlic boom is but the first chapter. What follows depends on us, on whether we choose unity over division, courage over hesitation, investment over exploitation. The eyes of the world are watching, but more importantly, the eyes of our children are watching. If this story stirred something deep inside, do not let it pass in silence. Like, share, and raise your voice. Subscribe, for too long Africa's victories were buried. Let us tell our story out loud, and as you leave your thoughts below, let the world hear you. Africa new. Africa rise. Africa can do it. Because this is not the end of history, it is the beginning of Africa's future.